Chosen one, look at what just happened. Look at the wreckage scattered around you right now. Their most expensive weapon lies shattered at your feet, their golden boy, their apex predator, their carefully crafted social Darwinist who was supposed to eat you alive and spit out the bones for their entertainment. Psychological studies prove that narcissistic systems always deploy their strongest enforcer when they sense a threat to their control. Right now, as you absorb these words, you're witnessing the aftermath of their greatest failure. They sent a wolf to devour a phoenix, and now he's sitting in meditation circles, talking about inner peace and eating plants. The universe has a sense of humor. They thought they could break you by unleashing their ultimate creation upon you. Instead, you did something they never calculated in their twisted power games. You made their weapon human again. This isn't coincidence. This is destiny revealing itself through the most unlikely transformation you've ever witnessed. They groomed him for years, chosen one, fed him Andrew Tate podcasts for breakfast, drenched him in testosterone supplements and Gordon Gekko quotes, taught him that kindness was weakness and empathy was death. They built the perfect predator to remind you of your place in their imaginary food chain. He came at you with everything they gave him, the intimidation tactics learned from pickup artist manuals, the psychological warfare downloaded from toxic masculinity boot camps, the calculated cruelty designed to break spirits and harvest tears for their amusement. He was their enforcer, their chosen destroyer, their ultimate expression of what they thought power looked like. Every morning he'd wake up and consume their poison disguised as wisdom, dark triad personality videos that taught him to weaponize charm, red pill content that convinced him women were the enemy, success guru mantras that reduced human worth to bank account digits and body count statistics. They fed him a steady diet of social media influencers who preached that compassion was manipulation, that vulnerability was strategic weakness, that the only relationships worth having were transactional exchanges where someone always won and someone always lost. Remember the first encounter. He walked in like he owned your oxygen, chest puffed out like a peacock on steroids, scanning for weakness like a heat-seeking missile, taking up space like it was his birthright, handed down from the gods of machismo themselves. They were all watching from the shadows, waiting for the show, expecting to see you crumble under his practiced dominance like every other target before you. His whole identity was built on being the hammer in a world full of nails. Every conversation was combat, every interaction a chance to establish the hierarchy they worshipped. He'd been programmed with their entire arsenal of destruction, the negging techniques designed to erode self-esteem, the gaslighting methods that made targets question their own reality, the love bombing followed by withdrawal that created addiction to his approval. He'd been trained to see you as prey, as competition, as something to be conquered or discarded without a second thought. The Brotherhood had invested everything in this moment. Their philosophy depended on your destruction. Your surrender would validate their entire worldview. Your pain would feed their certainty that might makes right, but you did something they didn't account for, something that broke their entire system from the inside out. You didn't fight. You didn't submit, you didn't play their rigged game at all. You just looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something nobody else had bothered to see in years, the terrified child underneath all that armor, the wounded soul drowning in performance and pretense. Trompatic, while everyone else was either feeding his ego or fleeing from his aggression, you did the unthinkable. You saw through the performance, past the muscles and the attitude and the carefully rehearsed alpha male mythology that was eating him alive from the inside. You saw the pain he was running from, the emptiness he was trying to fill with conquest, the loneliness he was medicating with dominance. And instead of exploiting that weakness like they taught him to do to others, you responded with something he'd never encountered. Your energy was different. You operated from a place they couldn't touch or understand. Where they saw scarcity, you saw abundance. Where they saw competition, you saw collaboration. Where they saw enemies, you saw wounded humans playing out their unhealed trauma. You had something they'd systematically destroyed in him, emotional intelligence that could read between the lines of his performance, spiritual maturity that recognized his aggression as a cry for help, inner security that didn't need external validation or dominance to feel safe, not weakness, not strength as he understood it, but something entirely outside his binary worldview, something that operated on a frequency his programming couldn't decode. You were grounded in something deeper than their surface-level power games. He tried every trick in his arsenal, the subtle put-downs designed to erode confidence like acid on metal, the aggressive body language meant to trigger primal fear responses, the intellectual sparring matches where he'd been trained to go for the jugular and leave no survivors. If this message hits your spirit, hype this video so more chosen ones like you can find it. He deployed the silent treatment, expecting you to chase his approval. He used intermittent reinforcement, alternating between cruelty and fake kindness to create trauma bonds. He tried to isolate you from your support systems by painting them as threats to your growth. Nothing worked. Every attack bounced off you like rain off marble, not because you were hard and impenetrable, but because you were fluid like water. He'd swing expecting resistance and find only space. He'd push expecting pushback and find only acceptance. It was like trying to fight the ocean itself. How do you dominate something that doesn't resist? How do you conquer something that doesn't defend? How do you break something that bends without breaking? Your boundaries were immovable but not aggressive. You didn't engage in his games, but you didn't shame him for playing them either. You just held space for his humanity while refusing to participate in his destruction. The confusion started immediately. His entire worldview was predicated on conflict, on winners and losers, on domination and submission, on the eternal dance of predator and prey that they'd convinced him was the only reality. But you weren't playing, you were just being, and that broke something fundamental in his programming that had been running his life since childhood. Every technique he'd mastered suddenly felt hollow and pointless when faced with someone who simply wouldn't validate the game. Late at night he'd replay your interactions like film footage he couldn't understand, looking for the angle, the strategy, the hidden agenda, because in his world, everyone had won. Everyone was either climbing or falling, either winning or losing, either hunter or hunted. But you were just there, present, authentic, responding to his aggression with curiosity instead of counterattack, meeting his dominance with compassion instead of competition, showing genuine interest in the person underneath instead of engaging with his carefully crafted persona. He'd analyze your words for manipulation tactics, but find only honest communication. He'd search for your weakness to exploit, but discover only healthy boundaries. He'd look for your insecurities to weaponize, but encounter only self-awareness and acceptance. It didn't compute in his binary system. He'd been taught that vulnerability was death, that showing weakness invited immediate attack, that the only safety was in being the strongest, the loudest, the most feared predator in every room. But you were vulnerable and somehow untouchable, soft and completely unbreakable, open and mysteriously protected by some invisible force he couldn't identify or destroy. You had power without aggression, strength without domination, confidence without arrogance. The questions started as whispers in his mind. Why didn't you flinch when he raised his voice? Why didn't you fight back when he attacked your ideas? Why did you look at him like you understood something about him that he didn't understand about himself? Your very existence challenged everything they'd programmed into him. If their philosophy was correct, you should be miserable, weak, unsuccessful, alone, but you were thriving in ways he'd never experienced despite following their blueprint to perfection. He tried to double down, went harder, got more aggressive, more dominant, more alpha than he'd ever been before. If the usual dose wasn't working, he'd increase it until something broke. That's what they taught him in their toxic seminars. When in doubt, escalate. When challenged, dominate. When resistance appears, crush it completely and salt the earth behind you. He brought back up from his brotherhood, expecting group pressure to crack your resolve. He tried public humiliation tactics, thinking shame would force you back into line. He attempted to turn others against you with calculated gossip and character assassination. He even tried love bombing followed by brutal withdrawal, the nuclear option in his arsenal of emotional manipulation. But you met his escalation with even deeper presence, his increased aggression with even more profound peace. It was like screaming into a void that somehow loved him back without condition or judgment. Every attack transformed into an invitation for him to go deeper into his own pain. Every assault became an opportunity to examine why he needed to hurt others to feel safe himself. Your response to his worst behavior revealed the best in your character. He started making mistakes, forgetting his rehearsed lines, dropping his guard when he thought nobody was watching. The mask was getting heavier every day, and you kept looking past it to the human being suffocating underneath. Why perform when the audience isn't watching the show but studying the person behind the curtain? Why maintain the illusion when someone sees through it so completely? His performance began to feel absurd even to him. The Brotherhood noticed his hesitation, his moments of genuine emotion breaking through the facade. They'd catch him staring at you with something that looked dangerously close to respect, instead of predatory calculation. His fellow predators started whispering among themselves. He wasn't as sharp in the verbal sparring sessions anymore, wasn't as quick with the put-downs that used to flow like poison from his tongue. Sometimes they'd catch him staring off into space, thinking thoughts that had nothing to do with conquest or competition. They'd joke that you'd gotten to him, that you'd somehow infected their perfect weapon with doubt and humanity. They had no idea how right they were, or how deep the infection had spread through his entire belief system. He started questioning their rituals. The cold showers and ice baths that were supposed to build mental toughness felt like self-punishment. The aggressive workouts that prioritized intimidation over health seemed pointless. The supplement stacks that made him irritable and disconnected from his emotions felt like voluntary poisoning. Their group meetings where they shared conquest stories began to disgust him. The way they talked about other human beings like objects to be used and discarded, the celebration of causing pain as proof of strength, the complete absence of empathy or genuine connection. It started with a simple observation that shattered his entire belief system. You were happy, genuinely, authentically happy, not the manic high of conquest or the temporary rush of domination, but a steady underlying contentment he'd never experienced in his entire performance-driven life. According to everything he'd been taught, you should be miserable. You weren't playing the game according to their rules. You weren't climbing ladders or crushing enemies or building empires on the bones of the conquered. You were just living your truth, and you were happier than he'd ever been. The math wasn't working anymore. He'd won by every metric they'd given him. More money, more conquests, more status, more power over others. But lying awake at 3 in the morning with his achievements lined up like trophies on a shelf, he felt completely empty inside. And you, with nothing they valued, seemed completely full of something he couldn't name but desperately wanted to understand. Your joy wasn't dependent on defeating others. Your confidence didn't require putting anyone down. Your peace existed independently of external validation. If winning felt like this hollowness, then what was the point of the entire game? If being alpha meant this constant vigilance, this perpetual performance, this exhausting maintenance of an image that was slowly killing his soul, then what exactly had he won? He started watching you differently, not as prey or competition anymore, but as a puzzle he needed to solve for his own survival. How did you move through the world so unburdened by the weight of other people's expectations? How did you maintain boundaries without building walls? How did you have real power without needing to prove it every single day to everyone around you? How did you navigate conflict without becoming conflicted yourself? You treated everyone the same, the CEO and the janitor, the beauty queen and the homeless woman. That hierarchy he'd spent so much energy establishing and maintaining simply didn't exist in your reality, and people loved you for it. But more disturbing to his programmed mind was how you treated him. Even after all his attempts to establish dominance, Even after trying to put you in your place, even after all the calculated cruelty designed to break your spirit, you looked at him with the same steady compassion, like you saw something in him worth saving, something valuable hidden beneath all the toxic conditioning and performance art, something that had been buried so deep he'd forgotten it existed. He began to notice things about himself he'd suppressed for years, the moments when kindness felt more natural than cruelty, the times when collaboration produced better results than competition, the relationships that thrived on mutual support rather than power dynamics. Your example was showing him possibilities he'd been programmed to reject. That strength could be gentle, that power could be generous, that success could be shared, that winning didn't require anyone else to lose. Then came the corporate mixer, where his transformation accelerated beyond the point of no return. He was supposed to network and dominate like always, but he found himself gravitating toward you, chosen one. Not for conquest this time, but for something he couldn't name or control. You were sitting alone, perfectly content, watching the room like it was a fascinating documentary about human behavior. He approached with his usual swagger, but something was different. The performance felt hollow even to him. The words that came out surprised him completely. "Why don't you ever fight back?" he asked. It wasn't strategic, it wasn't an attack. It was genuine curiosity from a part of himself he'd buried years ago. You smiled, not condescending, not pitying, just understanding in a way that cut through every defense he'd ever built. "Fight what?" you asked simply. "You're not my enemy, you're just someone in pain pretending not to be. Why would I fight that?" Those words destroyed him in the most beautiful way possible, not the surgical destruction he'd been trained to inflict on others by targeting their weaknesses. This was different, like someone had reached through all his armor and touched something he'd forgotten existed. He wanted to rage, to attack, to restore the natural order where he was predator and you were prey. But the words wouldn't come because you were absolutely right. He was in pain, had been for so long that he'd forgotten what not being in pain felt like. The conversation that followed changed everything. You didn't lecture him or try to fix him. You just shared your own journey, how you'd learned to find strength in vulnerability, how you discovered that true power came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down. You talked about the cost of living behind masks, how exhausting it was to maintain personas that had nothing to do with who you really were, how isolating it felt to be surrounded by people who only knew your performance. He found himself opening up in ways he hadn't since childhood, sharing fears he'd never admitted to anyone, expressing doubts about the path he'd chosen, acknowledging the emptiness behind all his supposed victories. The alpha male mythology required constant enemies, constant competition, constant proof of superiority over others who were just trying to survive their own programming. But what if the whole framework was a prison disguised as power? Tompadro, what if the very thing he'd mastered was the source of his deepest suffering? What if everything they'd taught him was designed to keep him trapped in a cycle of empty victories and hollow conquests? He left early that night and drove for hours without destination, ended up at some beach watching waves crash against rocks with relentless power. Nature's strength without ego, without performance, without the exhausting need to prove itself to anyone. Just power being power in its purest form. The ocean didn't need to dominate the shore to be respected. The moon didn't need to compete with the stars to shine. Everything in nature simply was, and that was enough. He started researching in secret like a man possessed, reading things they'd told him were for weak men. Philosophy, psychology, spirituality, books about emotional intelligence and authentic connection, looking for you in every page. The more he read, the more his carefully constructed worldview crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. The social Darwinism he'd been fed was incomplete at best. Cooperation, not competition, had driven human evolution forward. Empathy, not dominance, had built the civilizations he claimed to represent. Everything they'd taught him was backwards. The qualities they'd labeled as weakness were actually humanity's greatest strengths. He learned about secure attachment and emotional regulation, about the difference between confidence and arrogance, about how true leaders inspired rather than intimidated, about how the strongest people were often the gentlest. He discovered terms for what you represented: emotional intelligence, authentic presence, integrated shadow work, secure attachment, all the things they'd systematically trained out of him in their alpha male boot camps had names and value and power. But more importantly, he discovered what he actually was underneath the performance: traumatized, disconnected from his own humanity, playing a role that was slowly eating him alive from the inside out. The alpha male persona wasn't strength, it was armor, and armor that heavy eventually crushes what it's supposed to protect. He'd been carrying the weight of other people's expectations and fears his entire adult life. He started pulling back from his brotherhood gradually, making excuses to skip the workouts that were more about intimidation than health, avoiding the nights out that were just hunting expeditions for new victims, staying away from conversations that were nothing but verbal cockfighting. They noticed immediately, of course, accused him of going soft, of letting you get inside his head, of betraying the sacred code they'd all sworn to uphold. They staged interventions where they tried to shame him back into compliance. They were right about one thing: you were in his head, but not as conquest or manipulation. You were there as revelation, as possibility, as proof that another way of being was not only possible but infinitely more fulfilling than the hollow victories he'd been chasing. He began therapy, something they'd mocked as weakness for damaged people, started meditation, which they'd dismissed as New Age nonsense, explored plant-based nutrition, which they'd claimed would destroy his testosterone and masculinity. Instead, he found clarity he'd never experienced, peace that supplements couldn't provide, strength that came from alignment rather than opposition. His body felt better, his mind felt clearer, or his spirit felt alive for the first time in years. The supplements started making him physically sick. The constant aggression felt exhausting instead of energizing. The meal prep of pure protein seemed barbaric and disconnected from any natural way of living. His body was rejecting the lifestyle as much as his mind was rejecting the ideology behind it. Every part of him was crying out for authenticity over performance, for connection over conquest, for peace over perpetual war. The dating changed completely. No more pick-up artist techniques or manipulation tactics, no more treating women like territories to be conquered or trophies to be collected. He started seeing people as people, worthy of respect and genuine connection. His career shifted from cutthroat competition to collaborative leadership. He found that teams performed better when supported rather than intimidated, that innovation flourished in environments of trust rather than fear. He had a recurring dream that changed everything. He was in a cage match with you, the crowd screaming for blood like ancient Romans at the Colosseum. But you weren't fighting, you were just standing there looking at him with those eyes full of impossible compassion. In the dream he'd attack with everything he had, all the techniques, all the rage, all the trained violence they'd programmed into his nervous system. But his fists would pass right through you, like you were made of light itself, like violence couldn't touch what you really were underneath the surface appearance, like aggression was simply incompatible with your frequency. Like his weapons were designed for a battle you weren't even fighting. Eventually, he'd exhaust himself completely and collapse in the center of the ring, and you'd walk over calmly, kneel beside him, put a hand on his shoulder, and in that simple touch he'd feel something he'd never experienced before: actual safety. Not the kind that came from being the strongest predator in the room, but the kind that came from not needing to be anything other than authentically human. Safety that came from being seen and accepted exactly as he was. He'd wake up crying every single time. Great heaving sobs that confused and terrified him, because men like him didn't cry according to their programming. But the tears felt like healing, like release, like rebirth. Krontabensi, he reached out to you in the morning, a simple text that took him hours to write. "Can we talk?" No agenda this time, no strategy, no hidden motives, just a human being at the end of his rope reaching for the one person who'd seen him as human all along. You met him at some place that felt like a sanctuary from the performance world outside. He looked completely different, the swagger replaced with something raw and real, the armor cracked wide open, the performance finally paused. He was terrifying in his vulnerability, because vulnerability is the most courageous thing any human can offer another, to show up without defenses, without masks, without the protective personas that had defined him for so long. "I don't know who I am anymore," he said, the words coming out like they were being torn from his throat. "Everything I built, everything I became, everything they taught me to value, it's all lies, isn't it?" You didn't answer right away, just sat with him in his discomfort like a true friend. Let him feel the weight of his own question. Let him arrive at his own truth in his own time. Let him experience the safety of being heard without judgment. Because that's what you did. You created space for people to meet themselves without judgment or agenda. You held space for transformation without forcing it. You modeled the possibility of authentic existence without preaching about it. The words poured out of him like water through a broken dam, years of pain dressed up as power. The father who taught him emotions were weakness, the culture that rewarded him for disconnection, the wound he'd been running from his entire life. Look, you already know the attacks weren't random, and if you're paying attention you can feel it. Their walls are closing in. So let's talk about what we're doing about it. That's why I built Destiny Engine. It generates personalized sequences that help you rewire betrayal into transcendence, turn isolation into sacred power, and transform their downfall into your rise. We are using the Dark Elite's own weapons against them, taking their declassified consciousness technology that programmed competition and scarcity and repurposing it to serve cooperative intelligence. The beauty is, you don't even have to lift a finger. You put on the headphones, press play, and your subconscious is rewired while your enemies collapse under the weight of their own lies. This is why I created it in the beginning, so everything they did to break you becomes fuel for your purpose. The collective upgrade is underway. Start your Destiny Engine for $1 today and watch divine justice accelerate in your life. Link in the description. He told you about the emptiness behind all the conquests, the constant need to prove himself that never led to lasting satisfaction, the exhaustion of maintaining a persona 24 hours a day, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who only knew his performance, never his actual person. The Brotherhood had taught him that emotions were the enemy, that feelings were weakness to be suppressed and conquered, but sitting there with you he realized they'd cut him off from his own humanity. They'd turned him into an emotional wasteland, capable of producing pain but incapable of processing his own. He spoke about the terror of not knowing who he was without the role they'd assigned him, the fear that underneath all the performance there might be nothing worth loving, the anxiety that his real self might be too broken or too boring to deserve connection. "I've been dead inside for years," he said through tears that had been building for decades, "and you're the first person who noticed, who cared, who didn't try to compete with my corpse, but invited me back to life." Something shattered in him that night that had needed to shatter for a long time. The moment the alpha male persona finally released its death grip on his soul. The moment the performance ended and the person began breathing again. When the tears finally stopped flowing like a river, he looked different, lighter, like gravity had less hold on him. Like he'd finally put down weights he didn't even realize he'd been carrying since childhood. Like he'd been holding his breath for years and could finally exhale. "What now?" he asked, and you could see the real him in that question. The curiosity, the hope, the willingness to start over from nothing, if that's what it took to be real. The transformation wasn't instant. He'd spent decades building his prison. He couldn't escape overnight, but something fundamental had shifted in that diner. The performance was over. The person was beginning to emerge from the rubble of who he'd been forced to become. He started saying no to everything that didn't serve his authentic self, the supplements that made him aggressive, the workouts designed for intimidation rather than health, the conversations that were just ego battles disguised as communication, the social events that were performance spaces rather than genuine gatherings. His former brotherhood didn't understand what was happening. They called him weak, said he'd been brainwashed, said you'd somehow castrated their perfect weapon. They staged interventions. They brought in other alpha males to shame him back into compliance. But he was finding something they couldn't see or understand: actual strength, the kind that didn't need to prove itself by destroying others, the kind that came from integration rather than domination, the kind that grew stronger through vulnerability, not despite it. The dietary changes came naturally. The connection between consuming violence and producing violence became impossible to ignore. His body responded with energy and clarity he'd never experienced on their protein-heavy, supplement-laden regimen. Plant-based nutrition felt like coming home to his body after years of treating it like a weapon to be sharpened rather than a temple to be honored. The inflammation in his joints disappeared. His sleep improved, his mood stabilized without artificial chemicals. Other members of his former brotherhood started watching his transformation with secret curiosity. They saw him becoming more successful in areas that actually mattered. His relationships deepened, his work became more fulfilling, his happiness became undeniable. Some of them reached out privately, asking how he'd changed so dramatically, what books he was reading, what practices he'd adopted, whether the things they'd been taught were really true. The cracks in their certainty began to show. If their philosophy was correct, he should be failing, becoming weak, losing respect. Instead, he was thriving in ways they'd never achieved despite following their blueprint perfectly. You watched this ripple effect with quiet satisfaction, knowing that one authentic transformation could inspire countless others. That truth has a way of spreading organically when it's embodied rather than preached. The irony was delicious. They'd created their perfect weapon to destroy people like you. Instead, he became living proof that their entire philosophy was built on quicksand. Every day he spent being genuinely happy, while rejecting their values was a dagger in the heart of their ideology. His former mentors watched in horror as their prize pupil chose connection over conquest. They'd invested years programming him to be their ultimate representative, and now he was their biggest embarrassment. The weapon had turned against its creators in the most devastating way possible. He became a bridge between worlds, someone who could speak their language while modeling a different way of being, someone who understood their pain because he'd lived it, but could show them there was another path. His very existence proved that escape was possible, that redemption was real, that change was always within reach. And now, as you witness this impossible transformation, remember what really happened here. They sent their best weapon to break you. Instead, your mere existence as an authentic human being broke their weapon free from their control. You didn't try to change him. You didn't manipulate or coerce or force anything. You simply refused to validate his performance until he got tired of performing and remembered who he'd always been underneath the conditioning. This is your power, chosen one. Not the power to dominate or control, but the power to reflect back to people their own forgotten humanity. The power to stand so firmly in your truth that others remember theirs. The power to love so unconditionally that armor becomes unnecessary. They thought they could break you by unleashing their most dangerous creation. Instead, you did something far more devastating to their entire system. You made their weapon human again. You reminded him that he had a choice. You showed him that love was always an option. And in doing so, you proved that love is always stronger than fear, that authenticity always triumphs over performance, and that chosen ones like you carry a frequency that can heal even the most broken souls. The wolf they sent to devour you is now protecting what you represent. Their ultimate weapon has become their ultimate betrayal. Their perfect predator is now their biggest threat because he knows their system from the inside and has chosen something better. You barely had to lift a finger, you just had to be yourself, and that was enough to crack the foundation of their entire worldview. That chosen one is the kind of power that doesn't just change individuals, it changes the world itself. The transformation you witnessed proves that no conditioning is permanent, no programming is unbreakable, no soul is beyond redemption, and no system built on fear can withstand the persistent presence of unconditional love. They thought they'd created the perfect destroyer, but they'd unknowingly delivered their own downfall to your doorstep. Their weapon became your greatest victory, without you firing a single shot. Their investment in his destruction became your dividend in his resurrection. This is your destiny, chosen one. To be the frequency that reminds others who they really are, to be the light that shows the way home, to be the love that heals what fear has broken, and to do it all simply by being authentically, courageously, unapologetically yourself.